Over the summertime, we've been doing a short series on the parables that were too important to miss out in the Gospels. For those of you who know, there are four Gospels, three of which I believe they call the Synoptic Gospels, which include parables. That's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. For the astute among you, there's John, but there are no parables in John. So thank you. So we're looking at the parables that are in every one of those Gospels. Not the same parables are in all those Gospels, but these particular parables, there's a collection of parables that you'll find in Matthew and Mark and Luke. Angela talked about the parable of the sower at the beginning of the month. And then Jay followed on with the parable of the mustard seed. And I'm going to be talking about the new wineskins and old wineskins. I'm just going to start off by reading it. As you know, as I just said, they're in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I'm going to be focusing on the one in Matthew. So for those of you who aren't familiar with it, I'm just going to read it to you so you can start to get a bit more familiar with it. It's a very short one. And you could argue it's more an analogy, more a metaphor. But Jesus is being questioned about fasting, and let me read the passage to you from verse 14 to 17. So then John's disciples came and asked him, "How is it that we Pharisees fast," Pharisees being the religious people of the day, "but your disciples do not fast?" Jesus answered, "How can the guests of the bridegroom mourn while he is with them? The time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and they will fast. No one sews," and here's a parable, "no one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch will pull away from the garment, making the tear worse. Neither do men pour new wineskin into old wineskins. If they do, the skins will burst, the wine will run out, and the wineskins will be ruined. No, they pour new wine into new wineskins, and both are preserved." Now, I always find it helpful when you're reading passages of the Bible just to read around the passage a little bit. There's always a context. There's always a situation where often these stories, these parables, these passages come from. And if you look at all three of the Gospels, the passage that precedes this parable is the calling of Matthew. Now, if you don't know Matthew is one of the disciples. But what I find interesting, and the reason I'm focusing on Matthew, is it's his story, but it's the parable initially after his story. So if you look in Mark and Luke, the passage before the new wineskin, old wineskin parable is the calling of Levi. In the book of Matthew, it's called the calling of Matthew. Now, this isn't complicated this morning. Who wrote the book of Matthew? Well, it's Matthew, doesn't it? And so he's giving his story here. He's giving his testimony here. And for those of you who've ever heard someone's testimony, we heard Janice and Maxine, they gave back testimonies a few months ago. If you listen to someone's testimony, there's always something that sticks with you, isn't there? In your story, there's something that stuck out to you that either made you make a decision or just change how you perceive things. And so this is Matthew's story, essentially. And this is he's writing this parable from this perspective. And the passage of the calling of Matthew, as I said in Mark and Luke, it's calling of Levi. Matthew, interestingly, is either a given name or it's a name that he adopted after he started to follow Jesus. And it means gift of Yahweh, incidentally. But let me read the passage prior to the new wineskin, old wineskin passage. And this is the verses 9 to 12. As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. Matthew was a tax collector. "Follow me," and he told him, and Matthew got up and followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" On hearing this, Jesus said, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have come not to call the righteous, but the sinners." And what I find interesting is that this parable was written through Matthew's eyes. The passage preceding it was his own story, was his testimony. And there's that little phrase in there that isn't in Mark and Luke. that stuck out to him, that Jesus said that he noted, and he noted enough to write it down. He says, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice." Those words of Jesus were those words that stuck out to him, that he wrote in his story. And what I love about this parable is that there's lots of messages in this parable, and I'm going to go into it in a second. But there are so many different perspectives, of values of God and of Jesus that could be seen, and I believe that Jesus was trying to bring out. Now, if you're like me, the term new wineskin and old wineskin, over my head. It's not something I'm familiar with. Anyone drink wine from a wineskin? I'm guessing not. I'm a bit of a pleb when it comes to wine, not generally. Thank you very much. When it comes to wine, I'm one of those guys who, well, I have a theory, put it this way. I believe that everyone at some point in their life believes that rosé wine is a mixture of red wine and white wine together. And the point at which you find out shows whereabouts you sit in this grand society, the civilization that we live in. And, you know, I'm not going to apologize in advance. I was going to say, I don't come away from this thinking that I'm a great sommelier of wine, because I'm not, but I don't need to say that, I don't think. But the whole industry of wine, the whole stories behind it, it's something that I'm not really very familiar with, but I have gotten more so over time. You know, for those of you who don't know about how the process of wine is made, it varies from year to year. Wine, again, I'm talking as though I was being introduced to wine. Wine is made from grapes, but those grapes can vary differently. They can depend on the environment that they're in. They can depend upon the climate that they're in. They can depend on the vine that they come from. Did you know that many of the vineyards, especially here in the UK, they're not necessarily British vines. Their clippings have been taken from French vineyards and have been brought over. So much of the wine that you drink is related in that way to much of the original wine that was drunk that hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and it's been taken and it's been grafted in from other wines. And the grapes can vary year to year incredibly. Did you know that let's say, well, I like a Malbec, or I like a Merlot, or whatever. But that wine doesn't just come off of a certain grape and that particular vineyard. Often those are mixtures of wine. So let's say, for example, you like a certain type of red wine. They don't just produce that wine every year. They take grapes and wines from different vineyards, and they mix it together to create that Malbec, for example. And so often you find, depending on the harvest, on the season, you may get more or less of that wine, because if there's less of that mixture, then they can't make as much of the wine. It's not unusual for them to throw lots of wine away because they don't have enough of the ingredients to make that blend, if I put it that way, of wine. So it's not quite as sort of straightforward as that. Wine, it varies completely. Wine essentially is grapes plus yeast plus time. That's the very sort of simplistic equation of what wine is. The yeast eats the sugar in the grapes, and that produces alcohol, which produces the flavor. Same way as bread. The yeast eats the grain, produces carbon dioxide, which is the bubbles in the bread, and you eat that. It's that very simple process. It's that time element. It's that adversity element that can produce something of value. But it can spoil. You know, the process can go wrong. If you've ever been at a restaurant, a fancy restaurant, the waiter will open the bottle of wine, and they'll pour a little lynch, and they'll give it to you. And you have no idea why they're giving it to you, do you? Let's be honest. And they ask you to try the wine. And, you know, you try the wine like you're some civilized connoisseur, like you know exactly what you're trying to taste for, and you taste the wine, and you say, yes, keep pouring, please. And you have no idea what you're looking for, do you? You don't know what you're looking out for, and you try and put on this persona of, I know about wine, but you really don't. What they're actually doing there is what would happen more often back in days gone by was that wine would spoil. There'd be oxygen that would get into the wine. It would vinegarize, if that's the word, which it isn't. And it would change the taste of the wine. That process can be interrupted. So that's what they're doing. They're asking you to taste if the wine is off or it's not. And you can taste it because it's like vinegar. It's not even like you will know if it's off. So that process of grapes plus yeast plus time could be spoiled. And wine is it's a constant evolution. It's in a constant production. It's something that's happening all the time. We don't just open wine. It's taken years to get to that stage. It's taken years to produce that. A wine now, it's a bit of a luxury, isn't it? It's a bit of a nice thing. But it wasn't always like that. Wine was one of the few things that you could drink that you knew you weren't going to get sick. Often beer was one of the things, and gin was the other thing. That's why we have those fountains that sit outside those churches. They're not just statues. Often there are temperance fountains that would come where the church would produce fresh water so people wouldn't have to drink. They wouldn't have to struggle with addiction and things like that. So now, the wine back then was an integral part of everyday life. It's what we needed to survive. And that process. Again, that's what I love about this parable, is it contains lots of different messages. One of the messages is the acknowledgement of that journey. The acknowledgement of wine doesn't just arrive, it takes years to produce. It takes years to get to the good stuff. It takes years for it to develop that quality, to develop that maturity. And it's a process, it's a journey that it culminates in being something of value that's gone through a process. It's gone through adversity. It's gone through yeast eating away at the sugar. Sometimes it's been through heat or different temperatures. It's been sitting there for a while. And that's why the older wine is often the more expensive, because once it's gone, it's gone. You can't make old wine. As I said, there's a process here. And that price is an acknowledgement of the process that is limited in what it can produce. Whether there's, like I said at the beginning, sometimes you have good years where there's lots that's produced. Sometimes you have bad years where there's only a limited amount of wine. And often that is the most expensive wine, not necessarily because it's good, but because it has a quality and there's not much of it that's around. And one of the messages in this parable is that you can't make old wine. There is an acknowledgement of the journey that we're on. It's not at the expense of the new wine, but it's knowing that time is needed, that time is being added. And there's an equal value to the new wine and to the old wine. You need the old wine to get to the old. You need the new wine to get to the old wine. But new wine starts off as grape juice, equally nutritious, equally valuable, equally thirst-quenching, but mature wine has a different value, has a different need, so to speak, but they're both equally valued. And we look at the term new wineskins. Often the new wineskins, they were young, they were supple, they were fresh, they hadn't been used for anything. And what would happen is they would pour the new wine into these wineskins, and in the fermentation process, gas would be released. And the skins would stretch, and they would stretch to accommodate the gas. Because they had that suppleness, that flexibility, they could accommodate the adversity, they could accommodate the gas being given off in that process. The old wineskins had been through that process. They had stretched to capacity. If you've ever had an old football, it gets hard and it gets brittle, and there's only so much you can pump it up. It's a similar sort of dynamic. The old wineskins have been through the process, have been through the journey, and within them they contain this mature. They contain the good stuff, and I don't say that as inexpensive. The new stuff isn't the good stuff, because I like a good grape juice. I don't like the little grape juice that we have in our little pots for communion. That's a little secret between me and you. But I do like grape juice, and it's just as good as the mature wine. And I love the verse in Isaiah 54:2. An acknowledgement again of this. Isaiah, the Lord says, enlarge the place of your tent. Stretch your tent curtains wide. Do not hold back. Lengthen your cords. Strengthen your stakes. For you will spread out to the right and to the left. There's acknowledgement here of the need to build capacity. There's acknowledgement here of the need to stretch. And part of that is included in this parable about the process of stretching. Both are valuable. The young and the supple and the flexible, those who have been through the process and that are hard and are fully formed as a product. And interestingly, that although that new wine is the good stuff, when it's gone, it's gone. But that doesn't mean that the wineskins are done. Often those old wineskins would be used for oil or would be used for water. Equally essential, equally valuable. And because of the process they've been through, because of the journey they have been on, they were now useful for not just wine, but also water and oil to contain those substances as well that were just as essential into life. One of the best ciders I've ever had is a cider that was kept inside an old whiskey barrel. And it wasn't extra strong or anything like that, but it just had a subtle flavor. And I found it fascinating how this product had been kept inside a barrel that had previously been used for something else. And it had a taste, and it had a quality that I hadn't tasted before. And it was amazing. I was fascinated by the combination of the old and the new that were included in part of its process. And what Jesus is saying is that both have value. The young and the old, the new and the old. And that's another part of one of the messages in the new wineskin, old wineskin parable. It's the acknowledgement of grace, how important grace is, that change is happening, that you can't make old wine. It's a process. It's something that happens over time. And there needs to be a grace for that process, a grace for that time, for that new wine to mature. New wine, it stretches, it ferments, it pushes against things, it gives off gas. If that isn't the best analogy for young people I've ever heard, then I don't know what is. But that's part of being young, isn't it? That's part of stretching and trying and building capacity and it being uncomfortable and giving off to every chemical reaction that it gives off a product. And sometimes as human beings, we go through these processes. We're put in these, what sometimes feels like a test tube or feels like this controlled environment where we're undergoing a chemical reaction in life. Sometimes I think that's what marriage is. It's two people coming together and being in a covenant, in a commitment, and so being stuck together. And sometimes if you can keep together long enough, you come out being one and together. And I think marriage is part of that. It's keeping those two elements together, keeping them together so they can react and they can adapt to each other. And that's the process of wine here. And sometimes we approach, if I use church as an example, we can become very consumerist in our approach, and we don't necessarily understand the process. And it's important, I think, to understand the process. It's important to understand the journey, give grace for the journey from new wine to old wine. You may approach wine and think, well, I like red. And you might say, well, I like white. And if it's not that, then you don't like it. But I found in my own, I say my journey of wine, it's not really a journey. I found in my own understanding of wine, it's as I understand what the type of wine is and how it's made, that I can, well, maybe I don't like this wine, but this goes great with this. Or the reason it tastes like this is because this is how it's made for this purpose. And rather than saying, I do like this or I don't like this, I have an appreciation, that's the best word, an understanding of the journey that it's been through. And I don't approach it as a consumer and a connoisseur and become critical of it. I can appreciate the journey that the wine has been on or where it is in the process, and I can give grace for that. And sometimes we don't do that as a church. Sometimes we don't do that as people. Sometimes we don't do that in relation to other people. I think, I feel that the church generally has lost the ability to pray with its hands and feet. If that makes sense. I think sometimes we pray and we want God to move in our life, but I think praying with your hands and your feet is just as important. You know, James talks about faith and deeds, but I think sometimes we pray and we want healing and we want God to move, but then are we sitting on a couch with a whole pack of chocolate digestives and whipping through them in about 10 minutes? Are we looking after ourselves? Sometimes we want God to intervene in our financial situation. Do you have a budget? Sometimes we struggle with our relationships. We want God to move and to change the other person. But do we react within like 5 seconds of someone saying things? You know? I think praying with our hands and our feet are just important. It's just a part of that process. And I believe that part of this parable is giving the grace to understand that people are on that journey, that people are somewhere in the middle, either beginning or the end, but it's having grace for that, giving grace to that. And it's easier to give grace to that when you understand that the process is happening. Look at Jesus. He got irritated with the disciples on more than one occasion. And interestingly, when he did get angry, it tended to be at the Pharisees, at the religious people of the day. Why? Because they valued the rules and the rule book and what should be done over grace, over relationship with God. So I believe that this parable talks about acknowledgement of the journey. I believe it refers to giving grace for that. I also believe that it's an analogy of the church. It's a metaphor of the church. It's the young generation, and it's the generation that have been there. As I said, the young generation is, let's do it, let's give it a go, let's do it now. As I gave the explanation, young people often, they stretch and they push against things and they give off gas. But the older generation, the generation that's been there, the inclination is to say, I'm done. I've done my bit. It's not going to work that way. Or the inclination could be to check out. But what I love in verse 14 about this parable is that God values them both. It says the reason you have new wine in new wineskins and old wine in old wineskins, Matthew says, is that both are preserved. It's that both are valuable. And I think there's an acknowledgement here in this parable of the need for both. Get around people that have been through the process, have been the journey. Use their wisdom. Those who have been around, get around the passion and the motivation and the desire of the younger generation. There is a need for both to happen there. You have the good stuff, the mature stuff, the end of the line, the process stuff, but you also have the grape juice that gives you energy, that hydrates you. I think that they're both important. Matthew says in his explanation of this parable is that there is room for both. And if I can give you anything to take away this morning, it's that we've used the ingredients of wine is it's yeast plus grapes plus time equals wine. If you can take anything away from this parable, any of the messages that you could look at, I would say it's grace plus time plus Jesus equals who you are created to be. I believe that's the message of this parable here. And it plays into many messages about there's one body, one church, but many parts. It plays into the message of love, unconditional love. It plays into the message of perseverance. It plays into the parable of the mustard seed. It plays into the parable of the sower. It plays into acknowledgement of time needed for the journey. But if I could boil it down to anything, it would be it's who you are created to be is grace plus time plus Jesus. And Matthew says at the end of his parable, he says, men do not pour new wineskin into old wineskins. If they do, the skins will burst. The wine will run out and the wineskins will be ruined. No, they pour new wine into new wineskins, and both are preserved. And I'm going to leave you with, I'm going to ask the worship team to come up. We're going to finish on a song, but I want to leave you with one of my favorite verses here. And again, often we see in the Bible, in these parables, the same messages are repeated, the same messages echo, because we forget them, because we lose them. They get clouded over by the busyness and the white noise of life. And James, Jesus' brother, incidentally, in his book, again echoes this in James 1, verse 4. It says, "Perseverance must finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. If any of you lacks wisdom, he should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to him." And so there are many elements you could take from these parables that we talked about the last month or so. I encourage you, go away and just chew on them, just read them, just read the parable, then read it again, then read it a third time, and ask God, what are you saying in this parable? What are you saying to me in this parable? And there is gold in these stories. There is life lessons in some of these stories. But if you take away anything this morning, it's that grace plus time plus Jesus equals who you were created to be.